The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hi everybody, welcome to Unit 5 of the Lunch and Learn series, Understanding People and Their Personalities. I look forward to working with you over the next hour. I just want to do a quick sound check. Could I just ask people if they could type in clear over on the right-hand side under the question box. Thanks, Craig. That's good. Thanks, Michelle. Thanks, Brian. Morning, Brian. Thank you. Okay, sounds like I'm coming across loud and clear. Thank you. Thanks, Aaron. Excellent. Okay, it sounds like I'm coming across loud and clear. Of course, you'll get the slides, you'll get the recording as well at the end. So just relax and enjoy yourself during the course of the presentation. And of course, we're talking about people and their personalities. And what I was hoping that you would do prior to today was to complete that personality profile that I sent you. I hope you've had a chance to do that. But if you haven't, no drama, you can do that at the end of this presentation. But look, there are many, many personality profiles out there. There's DISC, there's MBTI, there's the team management profile. There are so many. There's myriad of these diagnostics. But the point about them is that they're really useful because what it does is it helps us to kind of understand and connect with the people that we're leading. And that's why I want to include this as a unit. So what so it's going to be a fun session, but I guess while I'm doing this, you'll probably be reflecting on some of the people that you lead, and you'll probably be able to, in some cases, categorize them around the personality types that I'm going to share with you. So where we've come from, and we're really on the home stretch now in terms of the Lunch and Learn series, we went through and looked at feedback in Unit 1. We looked at influencing styles in Unit 2. We looked at optimizing team performance in 3, getting the very best out of people last time in a fortnight ago. And now we're talking about people and their personalities. And our very final unit in 2 weeks' time will be on some tips and hints on facilitating more effective meetings. And so good, you've been able to go the distance, if you like. Your homework last time was around the whole notion of what Daniel Pink called autonomy, mastery, and purpose. So the whole idea was for you to start experimenting with the idea of giving people a sense of autonomy and how they do their work, being able to foster and develop their own capabilities by mastery, and also explaining the why of work and, the reason and the rationale behind why you're asking people to do certain things, and stick with it. So I hope you've had a chance to do that. So each of these units, of course, are trying to build on each other, and so it's not that one replaces the other. It's hopefully that you're building up your capabilities as we go through the process. So today we're going to look at a number of things, but obviously it's around understanding people and their personalities. So let's have a look at what we're covering today. So we're going to look at the whole concept of personality to start with, and there's some very interesting latest research on that I'll share with you now shortly. And then we're going to have a look at some of the personality traits around the model, and in particular the questionnaire that I sent you, and just to give you some indications of how that works. We're going to talk about some ways of getting the best from other people in relation to personality. So the personality styles will probably give us an indication about how we may best get the best out of the people we lead. And every one of us at some stage in our lives, and will continue to do, will have a personality clash with someone. And essentially, if you look at a personality clash, it's generally because we have a certain way of looking at the world and they have a certain way, and that those two ways don't always meet in the middle. So that's always a challenge for us when we're faced with that. And the last thing I want to cover in our hour together is this concept of the platinum rule. Now, there's the golden rule, and we're all probably aware of that. The golden rule is treat people how you want to be treated. Now, that's not a sound, but that's a pretty sound basis in life. But the platinum rule is a different rule, and that is the rule that we should treat people how they want to be treated, from a personality context, that is. So if we treat people how they want to be treated, then it's likely that we're going to be more effective as a team, as a leader. So the platinum rule, I'll just reiterate that at the end of our presentation today. And of course, the other thing is, if you've got any questions, comments, observations, don't be shy. You haven't been in the past, so I don't want you to be shy today. Just type in your questions and I'm more than happy to take those as they come. Okay, so let's talk about the general perspective of what I'm trying to do here today is to give you, to provide you with a fun and practical tool for understanding others and themselves. Now, as I said at the outset, there are lots of these tools out there. Some of them are good, some of them are not so good. But I think one of the interesting things about some of the tools that are out there is that some of the names or the labels that people use are a little bit complex. You know, if we give you, for example, 4 letters of MBTI, what does that actually mean? And, you know, you get all sorts of, there's other surveys I've seen that have got comments, you know, they've got categories like choleric and melancholy, and they don't really capture the essence of what that personality is. So what I've done in this survey that you've received and perhaps completed is get you to complete, and it's, you will have noted if you have finished it that there will be 4 categories that I've given you. But those 4 categories are the names of animals. And when you think about the names of those animals, owls, bulls, lambs and peacocks, it's fairly easy to get a very quick image in your mind of the sort of personality traits that that personality would exhibit. For example, if you think about a bull, you're probably thinking about, you know, somebody that's going to be fairly directive and forthright and dominant. And that's probably characteristics of the bull personality, for example. So I've tried to make it simple, as in easy to remember, so that you can have a bit of fun with this when you're actually working with your people and you are trying to understand how you might get the best from them, knowing their personality type. Now, let's talk about, and as I said, you've got those 4 different animals there. Now, let me just talk a little bit around the concept of personality, because it's a bit of a mystery to some people about personality. You know, does it change throughout life? Where does it come from? Can you be flexible, or can we categorize you? All of these questions come into play when we're talking about personality. So personality comes from the Greek word persona, which essentially means mask. So in other words, we all wear this mask. And the question that we've got to ask is, where does it come from, this mask? Is it something that we are born with, or is it something that has developed through our interactions in our world? So does it come from experience, or is it an innate type of concept? So we all got personalities, and we've all got different personalities in many respects. So Carl Jung was the first psychologist that came up with the notion of personality types, and he tried to classify people according to a personality type. Now you can imagine that that would have been hugely controversial in its time, and it was. And the reason it was controversial is that a lot of people said, his critics said, well, look, you can't categorize people. You can't, you know, put them into boxes, so to speak, that people are more versatile than that. And, you know, in some senses that criticism is probably very true. But what's actually happened, of course, is that these personality profiles have proliferated, and that I'd be very surprised if you hadn't completed one prior to doing the one that I've suggested here. And what's happened is that these personality profiles have proliferated because there is some face validity to them. In other words, when you look at the categories that you have been categorized as, you kind of think, wow, you know, that's pretty true. That's true. So perhaps there is a reasonable argument that we can, in some senses, typecast people according to personality, but certainly Jung was the first to come up with that. Now, the big question, does personality come from, are you born with a personality, or is a personality produced by your experience? Well, there's nothing definitive about this, because you can probably imagine it's not that simple to be able to demonstrate or prove. But what's happened is the pendulum swung over the years. Many years ago, maybe 30, 40, 50 years ago, the thinking around personality was that essentially you were a product of your environment. So, if you looked at your sum total of your experiences, you would probably say that that's what's molded your personality. And I guess there's some truth to that. I mean, if you're put into a leadership role, for example, in an early age, you kind of might learn to be a little bit more directive than you probably would be otherwise, and so forth. So that was the first key thinking around this. And then not so long ago, there was a view, maybe 20 years ago or whatever, where personality was an innate predisposition. It's not that it was hereditary. You didn't actually inherit your personality from your parents. Some would say, well, thank goodness for that. But what happened was that, there was a school of thought, a very strong school of thought that suggested that personality was something you were born with. And I think those of you who've got young children would understand that at a very early age, your children kind of have a certain characteristic about their personality, and you may be wondering, where did that come from? So there might be some face validity to the concept that personality is something that's innate. Now, the latest thinking on this comes from that neuroplasticity movement that suggests that our brain is, in fact, it's proved that our brain continually changes shape throughout our life. In other words, our brain is always developing. It doesn't actually stop developing. So there is an argument now that personality can change, and that you might be an introvert when you were younger and now you've learned to be an extrovert and so forth. So there is some view about that. My personal view, if you're interested, is that I think personalities are fairly set. I think what happens is that personality, meaning the Greek word persona, which means mask, our mask is something that protects us from the world. So in other words, what it means is that when we're under a lot of pressure, we will have a tendency to gravitate to the things that we feel comfortable with because we're under pressure. So if you're a fairly detailed person, under a lot of pressure, you'll probably make a lot more lists. Or if you're a very sociable person, under pressure, you'll become even more sociable. So I think there's some truth to that, because that's our way of protecting ourselves from our environment. But nevertheless, whichever view you have about this, and I'm more than interested to hear your view, I think there is some validity to the idea of personality type, and that's why I've got you to complete the survey. So let's launch into that and have a look at the personality types. So what I'm going to do is share with you a model of personality that is not uncommon and probably is a version of what's already out there, but it just sets the scene. So you'll notice that what's in front of you on this screen, it hasn't quite come up yet. There it goes, disappeared again. Here it goes. Good, it's there. So what you're seeing on your screen is you've got owls, bulls, lambs and peacocks. Now, let's have a look. Let's build this up. The first characteristic of personality is the words that I used before, which are introvert and extrovert. Now, there is a lot of nonsense that's written about introversion and extroversion, and a lot of myths and misunderstandings. The concept of introversion simply means, or concept of introversion or extroversion simply means how you recharge your batteries. So you're tired. How do you like to recharge your batteries? Introverts have a tendency to recharge their batteries by going within, if you like. That's being alone, going within, thinking through things and being on their own and pursuing activities around that. Extroverts, on the other hand, have a predisposition towards without. So they like to talk to people and engage in conversation. And that's how they recharge their batteries. Now, you might say to me, well, hang on a minute. It depends on either how many drinks I've had or what I'm doing or whatever. Sometimes I like to be on my own. Sometimes I like to be through with other people. And that's probably suggests that you're in the middle somewhere between the two extremes of introversion and extroversion, and many people are. But if you are, if you're clearly introvert or clearly extrovert, it'll make sense to you that there'll be a tendency for you to go within or seek out company and energize yourself that way. So if you have a look at the model there, the owl and the lamb personalities are more predisposed to introvert, whereas the bull and the peacock personalities are more, inclined towards extroversion. And so if you have completed your survey and you've got it in front of you, you might like to add up your owl and your lamb score on that page where you've got your totals. So if you add up your owl and your lamb score and you add up your bull and your peacock score, you will get a clarity around whether, you've scored more introvert or extrovert. So the bull and the peacocks are inclined to be more extrovert and the owls and the lambs are inclined to be more introvert. So if the scores are very even, then obviously it may validate your view that you really are in the middle between introversion and extroversion. But on the other hand, if your bull and peacock score is quite high compared with your owl and lamb score, then it might explain your extroversion. It won't surprise you, in other words. And of course, if your owl and your lamb score is higher than your bull and peacock score, it might, of course, confirm your predisposition towards introversion. Neither's right, neither's wrong. There's some great leaders who are introverts, and of course, there are some terrible leaders that are extroverts. So you can't distinguish. The other key thing about this is people say that introverts don't like people and extroverts do. Not necessarily true. It's just about how you like to recharge your batteries. Now, the other part of the model that's quite interesting is over on the right-hand side, we've got task and people. So in the work that you do, irrespective of what it is that you do, there are certain tasks and activities that have to be done. That's the nature of work. But also the nature of work is that we've got to work with and through other people in order to get these tasks done. So as a leader, we're always balancing task and people. So, making sure we've got good, productive working relationships with our people and that we're getting tasks done at the same time. But personality types can have a bias towards task or people. So, for example, the owl and the bull personality type is very predisposed towards a task orientation, whereas the lamb and the peacock personality are very much predisposed to the people orientation. Now, what I mean by that is that the owl and the bull would probably argue, let's get the task done and then we can build the relationships. Whereas a lamb and a peacock might look at it in the opposite way. They may say, let's build the relationship and then the task will go better. So if you want to know whether you've got a task bias or a people bias, simply go to your questionnaire and add up your owl and your bull score, and that will give you a task score, and add up your lamb and your peacock score, and that'll give you a people score. And obviously, if they're both equal, then you obviously are reasonably comfortable managing both of those with equal weightage. But of course, if your task score is significantly higher, then it's probably may explain the way you go about your work, which is very task-oriented. Whereas if your people score is significantly higher, it probably explains that your lamb and your peacock score is, the people side of the business is the fun part, if you like. So what that does is it provides us with 4 personality types: owls, bulls, lambs, and peacocks. So what I'm going to do now is I want to talk about each of these personalities and give you a couple of real-life examples of people that are famous who fit these models. And then I want to spend some time talking about how you might get the very best from these people as you go. All right, so let's first of all, are there any questions any of you got at this stage? Anyone, or any comments, any observations, anything at all? Because happy to take those on board before we launch into the different personality types. Okay, nothing at this stage. Fine. Okay, that's good. Let's move on and let's have a look at the peacock. Now, in the survey, you've got them in this order. Now, don't think for a minute that the order means anything. It really doesn't. I'm just simply saying I actually don't really know. Someone had to go first, so we're just going with the peacocks to start with. All right, so peacocks. Now, if we have a look at the peacock personality, the first thing that I'd say about the peacock personality, there's a primary motivation for all the personalities. And the primary motivation for the peacock personality is being popular. Now, all of these motivations are ideals. They're not, you could never completely achieve them. So being popular is an ideal, because the reality is that we can't all be popular. And at times there are people who, for whatever reason, it might be the clothes we wear or whatever, they don't like us. So it's impossible to be popular all the time. But the peacock strives for that. Now, what their characteristics are, as I said before, they see themselves, well, we see them as extroverts. So they're very much, will often be the life of the party, will often be the ones who will dominate meetings and do all the talking. They are talkers more than listeners. In fact, listening is not their forte. They'd rather talk than listen, and that's, of course, how they energize themselves. And they usually are optimistic by nature. So the glass is half full, not half empty. That would be the way the peacock would view the world. So they'd look at situations as opportunities rather than problems, generally speaking. So if we look at their strengths, usually they have very appealing personalities. They've usually got a great joke, or they'll make us laugh, or, we all know somebody like that. If it's not you, I'm sure you're aware of people like that. By the way, the male-female issue is irrelevant here. These transcend gender. So, it's, people often ask me, are there more females than males, or more males than females in the? No, it's just, look, if you could divide the world up according to this kind of model, you'd probably find roughly 25% in each. So that's the way it is. But nevertheless, the peacocks have got appealing personalities. They're quite creative and colourful, probably enjoy being a little bit flamboyant, might wear some bright clothes, usually have a loud laugh. You can hear them on the other side of the room. They usually can get themselves quite excited. They actually burn out quite easily as well. and they can be a bit of an inspiration when they need to be. So every team who has somebody who's a peacock, um, you know, interesting enough, of all the personality types, the peacock is the one who is probably likely to get away with more at work than anybody else, because people just dismiss the peacock personality and say, oh, that's just Fred or Mary, that's just the way they are, you know. So they're able to get away with a lot of things because they've got that energizing, engaging personality. They can also be a pain in the you-know-what at different times, depending on who you are and where you did, what they're saying. So if you look at two famous people, and what I've tried to do here is to select a couple of famous people, both male and female, and I've tried to keep that balance going for all of these slides. So if you think about Paris Hilton, now she's been a bit quiet lately, but at one stage in her career, she was in every gossip column and magazine that you could possibly get your hands on. And in fact, she ended up doing a stint in prison for, it might have been tax evasion, I think. I'm not quite sure what it was, but I do recall clearly that when she went to prison, she made it a publicity stunt. She wanted everyone to know, and it was kind of like, she was turning it into some sort of a, advertisement, if you like. And I don't know about you, but if I ever had the misfortune of ending up in prison, I don't think I'd want to. I just think I'd just quietly do my time and come out. I don't think it's something that I'd want everyone to know about. But the peacocks. So if you think about the movie star, the classic Hollywood movie star, at the end of the day, most of them would be peacocks. Reason being, and they would argue that whether something's accurate or inaccurate in the gossip columns is irrelevant, or at least less important than whether they're in the gossip columns. So that's the sort of how the peacock might think. So the great Scottish comedian, Sir Billy Connolly. Now, unfortunately, at the moment, I think he's suffering from Parkinson's disease, but anyone that's seen Billy Connolly in action, whether it's on television or live, would know what I'm talking about. He would just go off on tangents. There'd be no structure to his presentation. I have heard and read that he doesn't prepare before he goes on stage. He just goes with whatever comes into his head at the time. So he's a classic peacock, if ever there was one. So there's a couple of examples, and their motto in life is that any publicity is good publicity. So really, that gives you a bit of an idea. And if you fall into that category, I'm sure some of that resonates with you. And if you don't fall into that category, I'm sure you would know people that you work with who would fit that bill. Okay, so that's the peacock. Now let's talk about the bull. Now the bull, their primary motivation is being powerful. Now, like the peacock, the primary motivation being popular, it is impossible to be powerful all the time. There will be certain situations where you are powerless, and there will be other situations where you're powerful. But what the bull tries to strive to do is to be in control. Why do they want to be in control? Well, because they feel very insecure about the idea of being taken advantage of. So bulls are terrified of being taken advantage of. So in order not to be taken advantage of, there is a tendency there for them to assert their power. So they can be very powerful figures, if you like, in terms of leadership. And their characteristics are, now they're all, as I said earlier, they are like the peacock in the sense that they're extroverts. So they like to engage with people generally. They're doers. So what happens is that the bull usually has 10 or 15 projects all happening at once, lots of balls in the air, and they usually take on more than they can chew. So that's how they like to operate. But like the peacock, they're also optimists. So there's a tendency for them to see that the glass is half full, not empty. They see challenges as opportunities to demonstrate something. So I'm sure we've all come across that personality. You may well fit the mould if you've done the questionnaire, and maybe those things are resonating with you. So they're great strengths. They're born leaders. Now, that before you start puffing out your chest if you're a bull, what I mean by that is that I'm not saying that you make good leaders. What I'm saying is that you have a natural inclination to leadership. So what that means is that you, of all the four personalities, are the most likely to feel comfortable in a leadership role because it's a position of power. So you can put yourself into something where perhaps there's less likelihood that someone would take advantage of you. It doesn't necessarily mean that you are a great leader. So don't get too cocky about that. But the leader, the bull, is very goal oriented. So they usually aren't interested in the detail. They just want to know what the big picture is. Just tell me where the finish line is. I'll worry about how I get there in my own way, but just I want to know what the and they'll often say things like, what's the bottom line? So they're quick to move into action, and they don't usually procrastinate, and they're pretty impatient with people who like to procrastinate, if that makes sense. So a couple of famous personalities that fit the mould. Well, I've picked two females here because there might be some kind of stereotyping that might think this is a male personality trait. But if you think about Madonna's musical career is still going, and she has managed to beat the odds. She's managed to manage her own career very effectively, whether we like her music or don't like her, whatever we might think. I don't think she really cares. She's just done extremely well, and she's not that interested in necessarily being popular, although obviously she wants to be well known. And Hillary Clinton, of course, who was in the famous 2016 election with the current president, Donald Trump. Hillary Clinton clearly is a bull. I mean, she is no nonsense, very straight to the point, knows what she wants, and just goes for the bottom line. So there's two examples of bulls of the female gender. So their primary motivation as a bull is that I'm in control and I'm willing to lead. So that's pretty much how they like to operate as such. So that's the two extroverts, the peacock and the bull. So let's now move to the introverts and have a look at their personality. So the first one I'm going to look at is the owl. Now, the owl personality, if you got the highest score in this, it'll make a lot of sense to you, but I'm sure, again, you're either leading people who have this personality, or you have led or will lead people who have the owl personality. So their primary motivation is being perfect. Now, again, like being popular and like being powerful, it is impossible to be perfect. Nobody is perfect. And that means that what the owl is always striving to do is to get to perfection. But of course, perfection is elusive, so just as popularity and power is as well. So these motivations are ideals that drive the behaviour of these personality types. And some of the characteristics, if you like, of the owl are that they are introverted by nature. So there's a tendency that they will, they will spend a lot of time thinking, processing in their head before they communicate a message, and often they will have put a lot of thought into what they're going to say. So they are thinkers, and sometimes they'll think very deeply about things. I remember talking to someone the other day who was a classic owl, and I said to them, how's your day been? They said, oh, no, something very strange happened to me this morning. I said, what happened? They said, well, someone said hello to me in the hallway. And I said, oh, maybe they were just happy. Who knows? They said, oh, no, there's something very strange going on. There's something going on there. They want something. So there's a little bit of a tendency to overthink sometimes about things. And, they might overthink and overcomplicate things. So there's a tendency that they are glass half empty rather than half full, unlike the peacock and the bull. So, what they will do is they will look at situations from a risk-averse point of view and be able to pick up and summarise what problems might arise before other people. And that can be very valuable if it's used effectively, but it can also be very annoying if people don't understand where that's coming from. It might be seen as a negative attitude, in other words. So their great strengths is that they love to stick to schedules. They'll probably have to-do lists. They'll probably be overcommitted to-do lists. They have very high standards, not only of other people, but interestingly of themselves. So they will be their worst enemy, and they will be very, very critical of themselves, which is often misunderstood by the other three personalities, as much, if not more, than they would be critical of other people. So they're very orderly and they're very organised, very systematic. And, if you wanted to upset an owl, all you do is just turn the whole thing upside down and just have a fly by the seat of your pants type approach at work, and the owls will become very upset very quickly because they like order and structure. Two personalities that fit the mould is the great tennis player Roger Federer, who must surely be close to retirement at this stage, but he is a perfectionist in the sense that he probably trains as hard, if not harder, than any other tennis player on the tennis circuit, even now that he's in his late 30s. And that's one of the reasons, of course, that he's been highly successful. And the other example I'd give you is a historical figure, Leonardo da Vinci. Now, you may recall at school that you would have noticed these sketches of the human body. You can see down in the right-hand corner there that Leonardo da Vinci did these sketches of the muscular system of the human body. Now, what's interesting about that is that the story goes that when he wanted to do those drawings that you're seeing there, he actually went into a graveyard. And actually, I'm sure in those days you didn't need a permit. Even now, I don't think you'd get a permit. But he went into a graveyard and he dug up some bodies and he dissected them because he was keen to understand how the muscular system worked, because he wanted to depict the perfect drawing of the muscular system. And that's exactly what happened. That's a perfectionist to the extreme. So the owls are very sensitive. They get hurt very easily. But at the end of the day, of the four personalities, they'll ask this question: how can I paint this perfect picture? So they're all through their work, it's all about doing it right. And sometimes it'll take them a long time to get the job done, because they're always striving to get it right. Finally, the lamb. Now, the lamb personality, like the owl personality, is introvert. But before we get into that, their primary motivation is being peaceful. Again, it's an ideal. You get two people on a desert island and there won't be peace at some point. There'll be an argument. So it is impossible to be peaceful all the time with all the different types of people. You will always be at loggerheads at some point. But nevertheless, the lamb personality tries very hard to build good relationships up with all the people they work with. That's their predisposition. And some of their characteristics, as I mentioned earlier, They are introvert by nature, so, they'll tend to be quite private in their lives. They don't want too many people to know too much about them. And they're usually watchers, so when you're having a team meeting, what the owls will tend to do is listen to all the other views of everyone else around the table in the team, and once they've heard all the views, they will perhaps proffer their own view. And usually that view won't be terribly controversial because, of course, they don't want to rock the boat. Relationships are very important. So, like the owl, the glass is half empty, not half full. So there's a tendency for them to be a little bit down. They're not terribly demonstrative. You probably don't see them full of excitement and enthusiasm on their face. They don't tend to carry that with them like the peacock might. So they tend to be introvert watchers and pessimists. So what are their strengths? Their great strengths are if they're lambs, they're usually pretty competent and steady workers. So if you give a lamb a job with some very clear directions on how to do things and set them off on their way, and their competence is sufficient enough to complete the task, then they will get it done reasonably well. So they will tend to be very inoffensive. They'll be peaceful and agreeable. In fact, they're great because people don't feel in any way, shape or form intimidated by the lamb. In fact, that's the last thing they want to appear is intimidating, and they're not. And usually they're very good at mediating problems. So if two people are having an argument, they're often the one that can see the middle ground between the two camps or two people, and they can often use that to their advantage in placating conflict. So they don't like conflict, and they do what they can to avoid it at all costs. So who do we know who may fit the bill? Well, I've picked two actors here, one male and one female. I did say to you before that most movie stars would fall into the peacock category, and that's very, very true. But I said movie stars. If we're talking about actors, as in the craft of acting, they come across on all four personalities. But in the case of Keanu Reeves, who, of the Matrix fame, that sort of movie star, that actor, I should say, and Kirsten Stewart, the female actor in some of those teen films that have come out recently, which obviously I'm familiar with. I'd mention the name, but I'll get it in a minute. But anyway, we all know who they are because we've probably all seen a movie with them in, and they're both great actors. There's no question about that. And but they're very, very private people. I mean, Keanu Reeves is not interested in being in the gossip columns. In fact, he did a very famous interview a few years ago where he took great offence at being photographed on the streets of New York when he was having a sandwich. You can see him on the park bench there. He doesn't dress extravagantly. In fact, he doesn't do anything extravagantly. He's a very average person, and no one would know that he is worth millions and millions of dollars unless they knew who he was. He doesn't like attention, nor does Kirsten Stewart. Both of those two are very private individuals. So that gives you some example, and most lambs are very private. They don't want you to know too much about what they're doing. So guys, there's the four styles. Has anyone got any questions or comments? We've got about 15 minutes before we wrap up, and I'm going to use that time to talk about how you might approach each of these four personalities and some of the things that you should avoid and some of the things that you perhaps should do. And that, of course, is the platinum rule we talked about, treating people how they want to be treated. So if you've got any questions, comments, observations, insights, go to the question box, type it in, and I will certainly deal with it as we go. So while you're thinking about that, let's move on. And of course, I should say that the lambs primary objective is peace. So peace is the overriding objective. All right. So let's talk about these different personalities in terms of what you might do to get the very best from the people that you lead. So let's go through that. Now, peacocks. Now, we all notice a peacock in a room because they're not going to be shrinking violets. We'll all notice them. They'll all have something to say. They'll all be looking for an audience, and they've probably all got a story to tell. So how do you as a leader deal with that? Now, when you look at the model, opposites are often interesting because that's often where you have the biggest issues. And interesting enough, if you looked at relationships, the old saying, opposites attract, that's absolutely true. That peacocks will often, be attracted to owls. Why? Well, owls can organise peacocks, and peacocks, of course, can lighten up owls. And lambs and bulls are often attracted to each other. Why? Well, bulls can boss lambs around, and lambs can just keep the bulls in a peaceful mode as much as possible. So it's kind of like a survival instinct that you don't obviously get people to fill out the personality profiles, but what happens is that's the way it goes in a lot of cases in relationships. But in the work space, that these examples, these dichotomies I'm explaining, are often the sources of frustration, that often the peacocks don't understand the detail orientation of the owls, and the owls can't quite understand why the peacocks haven't thought through something, or the bulls can't understand why lambs have trouble making a decision, and the lambs can't understand why the bulls are so short, sharp, and to the point, and why they want to rock the boat and they're not worried about offending people. So we all have these kinds of thought processes in the work. So let's have a look at the peacock. Now, recognise that they have trouble following through. So often you need to, send reminder emails, and because they just, they're not naturally structured people. So structure is not their forte. And so sometimes you have to give them some structure in order to help them. They'll appreciate that as long as it's not imposed on them too much. They sometimes will think before they speak. They don't bring their brain into gear. Sometimes they speak and then they realise, of course, that they've said something that perhaps they shouldn't have said. And they'll often justify this by saying that I'm thinking out aloud. And that's what they do. They actually do think aloud. But of course, by thinking aloud, they'll often have not thought about the implications or the consequences of what they've said. So that just understand they're not actually out to offend anyone if they've said something quite offensive. It's just because they haven't thought it through very carefully. And realise that they like a lot of variety and they like a lot of flexibility, and they certainly are not interested in routine work. Now, obviously, all jobs have routines associated with them, but the peacock is the personality that's least interested in doing that. And don't expect them to remember appointments or even be on time, because of the four personalities, they're probably the least likely. They'll go on whims. They are, very much kind of in the moment, and they're not necessarily noted for their punctuality, although they can learn that, of course. So don't get too wound up about that, unless, of course, it's absolutely critically important. Be prepared to hear their stories. They'll always have some story. They're natural storytellers, and they'll have some story to tell. And by entertaining some of those stories, by listening to them, you will often find that they will have a tendency to listen to you. So give them the opportunity. Of course, not all stories. If you encourage them too much, they won't stop talking. Now, what about the bulls? Now, the bull personality, what are some of the things that you need to think about in order to get the very best from the bull personality? Well, the first thing we should establish is that they They're comfortable leading, as I mentioned earlier. So therefore, if they're comfortable leading, if you gave them a leadership role, albeit even a short project type job to do, they will be perfectly comfortable with that because they enjoy leading. And of course, if they're leading, there's likelihood, of course, of them being taken advantage of. At least that's in their own mind. So you can give people those jobs without any problem at all. But one thing that you need to do if you're dealing with a powerful bull is that you need to insist on two-way communication. It is not a good idea to allow them to walk all over you. And in fact, the natural tendency would be, say for a lamb particularly, or an owl, is that when the bull is starting to assert him or herself, the other personality will have a tendency to take a step back. In other words, give them space. This is not a good idea because what happens is the bull moves into that space, and what happens is you're up against a wall very quickly. And then you start rationalizing and thinking, what's wrong with the bull? I'm trying to give them space, and all they're doing is taking up all the space. Well, if you talk to the bull, what they're doing is their rationalization is that there's a vacuum there that needs filling. So what I'm going to do is fill that vacuum. And that's what they're thinking. So in other words, if there's no leadership there, I'm going to fill the void. So that's their approach as such. The third element is that they know they don't, then try and understand that they're not actually out to hurt. They're probably not into chit-chat, small talk and all that sort of stuff. That's not their forte. So they know that they don't mean to hurt. They're just basically wanting to get to a task. Remember, they're task-focused. They want to get to the point. So know that they don't mean to hurt. Be firm and to the point. And what I mean by that is that when you're dealing with the bull, you need to be very firm as to what you want and don't waffle on. Just get straight to the point. They will appreciate that. They don't need all the chit-chat and the niceties. They just need to know what's expected of them. And I don't mean, when I say firm, I'm not saying aggressive. I'm just saying firm. Just tell them what you need to do and tell them what the big picture is. Don't give them all the detail, and off they go, and they'll respond reasonably well to that, and they'll rise usually to the challenge. Just recognise that they don't wear their heart on their sleeve. They're not really going to show outward signs of compassion. Now, that doesn't mean they're not compassionate people, and it's one of the most misunderstood elements of the bull, is that the bull actually is quite compassionate, but they don't go around showing it. Now, why don't they show it? Well, for the simple reason that people could take advantage of that. Remember, power is their base. So if I walk around looking like I'm wearing my heart on the sleeve, then I'm open to being manipulated by other people. So I'll tend to hold that within. But that doesn't mean that they're not compassionate. The biggest misunderstanding about this personality type. Righto, the owls. Now, owls. Owls are one of the most interesting personality type. Of the four personalities, the owl is the one who is the most sensitive. All right, so you can hurt the feelings of an owl very, very easily. Why? Because they're perfectionist and they want to be perfect. They will try to, they dress, they groom perfectly. They're very, precise about how they do things. And so therefore any criticism of them at all is likely to be taken very harshly by themselves. Okay, to heart, in other words. Realise that they're programmed with a mindset that likes to assess risk. So they will look at things well before the other three personalities and be able to assess the level of risk and where that risk might be. So they're very good at being able to assess risk. And if that's harnessed correctly, it can be a great benefit for the team. So the reason I'm sharing that with you is so that you can harness that, but also understand that they're not just negative for negative sake. It might come across that way, but they're programmed to look at risk. It's not just about being negative. And I think sometimes this is the biggest, or one of the biggest misunderstandings for the owl. Be prepared to answer their questions. So if they ask you a question, they're expecting a detailed and precise answer. It's no good saying, oh, she'll be right, don't worry about it. That is probably not going to be that's not going to be a good answer for the owl. They actually need to, they want the right answers. They read the fine print. They will actually, if you give them something to read, they'll read it. They'll read the fine print. They're into detail. They want to get it right. That's the critically important thing. So don't be too frivolous when you're dealing with the owl as a personality. Try to keep a reasonable schedule. They won't be happy if the meeting starts half an hour late or even worse, 10 minutes early or whatever. So try and stick to a reasonable schedule because they respond very well to that. In fact, they don't respond to a situation where a good schedule is not kept. Realise that your arguments and opinions need to be backed up with some substance. You can't just say something without demonstrating some evidence. They're very evidence-based. They want to know where the source of that information has come from. So it's very important that you be very precise when you're dealing with the owl as such. Finally, the lamb. Let's understand how to deal with the lamb. Now, the lamb, of course, needs to be absolutely crystal clear about where you are heading. So lambs respond very well when you set them tasks and goals. You do that to a bull and you might not find it'll work so well, but the lambs need to clearly understand what you're trying to achieve. That's very important to them. So try and help them set agreed upon targets. So the whole purpose there is to get them to set some targets. This is not a natural forte of the lamb. So your job as a leader is to help them get to those targets by at least setting the targets initially and getting some commitment from the lamb that they will, agree to meet those targets. They don't always display outward signs of enthusiasm, so you're not necessarily going to see them all excited on the outside because they have a tendency to be introverts. So they're not likely to demonstrate that outwardly, but that doesn't mean they're not enthusiastic. This is one of the biggest misunderstandings about the lamb, is that we think they're not getting excited about this. Well, they probably are, they're just not showing it. Realise that they're putting things off. If they do that, they're usually doing that because that's their form of control and that's how they like to operate. Thor's asking, is it possible to be a lamb at home and a bull at work? Is it possible to change your dichotomy at different situations or environments? It's an interesting question, Thor, and my answer to that is probably no, based on what I said earlier. But you can be accommodating in different situations, but it's probably likely that you will be what you'll be, and it becomes quite important. But obviously you're asking that for a particular reason. But in certain situations you can be more confident and so forth. But my sense is no, but I have heard that question raised before. I think you can be different at home and work, but it might not necessarily be explained by personality, if you like. So with lambs, look for a mutual commitment. Try to look for some degree, because if you get some agreement, then you basically know that they'll follow through. All right, so I'm just about to wrap up, and I just wanted to say that you've all heard about the golden rule, of course, treat people how you want to be treated. But the platinum rule is treat people how they want to be treated. And my whole point about this hour together is to simply say to you that you should be applying the platinum rule, not the golden rule. And I think if you do that, you'll get a much better result. And your homework, as you could probably imagine, will be to go away and start to treat people how they want to be treated rather than how you want to treat them. And I think you'll find you'll get better results. And that's the whole purpose of what we're doing, to build up better working relationships with the people that you lead. So, folks, that's it for me. And we meet again in a fortnight and we'll look at facilitating effective meetings. If you haven't done the personality profile, can I urge you to do it? Now that you've got, the justification, it would be quite interesting for you to actually determine how that might look. Just got a few questions here. Craig says, if two of the same type are in the room, one stronger than the other, will that be along the lines of what Thor is asking? Two bulls, one is less dominant. Yeah, good point, Craig. Because you slide across this continuum, don't you? I mean, if you had 20 points, for example, in any of those four columns, then obviously that means that that's quite dominant, because over 50% of your personality is there. Erin says, thank you, Tim. Very interesting. Thanks, Erin. That's a nice thing to say. Yeah, so hopefully that's responded to your question. So, guys, that's it from me. I need to dash, so thank you, and we'll see you in a fortnight. But do your personality profile if you haven't already done it, because I think you'll find it very interesting. Thanks, guys, and all the best. Have a great weekend.